This is Kevin Haggerty with J. Davidson Frame, discussing Dr. Frame's thought-provoking book, Framing Decisions, Decision-Making that Accounts for Irrationality, People, and Constraints. David, I'd like to begin by asking you to please explain the meaning of the title of Chapter 9, Toward an Empirically Rooted Understanding of Decision-Making.
Sure. The rationale of this chapter is pretty simple, and that is if we're going to understand how people make decisions and why they make the decisions they do, we need to go directly to the source. Okay, we need to talk to these people. We can conduct interviews. We can have them fill out questionnaires. We can even conduct experiments where we pose different decision-making scenarios in an experimental sense and then see how people respond to these different scenarios. So all of these constitute what's called empirical research. You're actually viewing the subject directly and then noting how the subject behaves.
Could you give some examples of the sort of studies that have been done?
Yeah, these studies are really quite recent, okay, and being carried out in a formal sense, and they fall into really two broad categories. One would be studies carried out by psychologists, in particular experimental psychologists, and then we also have studies in neuroscience. Okay, and interestingly, both the sort of current generations of studies owe their origins to the mid-1990s. Now, in the case of the experimental psychology, we can pretty much identify the origin as being tied to the work of a professor at the University of Virginia named Timothy Wilson. And he would do experiments with his undergraduate students in introduction to psychology courses. And he actually did some. The studies he did were kind of fun and they were interesting. I think he was onto something. He basically set up good hypotheses. His principal hypotheses that he's famous for in the studies that he carried out in the mid-1990s was that people can overstudy a problem in trying to make a decision. If you study something too much and you spend too much time reflecting on it and rationalizing why you should decide one way as opposed to another, you're going to create inferior decisions. So he actually did some experiments amongst the students and came up with conclusions that yes, indeed, you can overstudy a problem.
I noticed in Chapter 9, it sounds like you're critical of the approaches taken in some of these studies. Is that the case?
Well, I'm particularly critical of some of the studies carried out by experimental psychologists because, as we saw with Timothy Wilson, they almost all of the studies are based on carrying out experiments on undergraduate students, okay, who are in an introductory course on introduction to psychology type of a course. So part of my problem is then that by focusing on these very young students who are undergrads, who don't have much life experience, who typically these are at prestige schools. The University of Virginia is one of the top schools in the United States. When you take a look at, when you query these people, carry out experiments, you're really carrying out experiments on young people who are in the earliest stages of maturity, who probably have very high IQs, averaging 115 and 120 because it's very competitive to get into these schools, who come from affluent backgrounds, okay, who are basically, they're hardly representative of a typical person who's involved in decision-making. Most decision-making in the United States of real consequence, by the way, is carried out by adults who are well into their 30s or 40s or 50s. So what is it that these studies carried out by so many of these experimental psychologists focused on undergrads, what is it that these studies really tell us about adults?
I see. So, well, how would we improve these studies then?
Well, what you need to do at a minimum is to try to come up with representative samples. One of the most famous scholars in the area of decision making is Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner. He recently, a year or two ago, came up with a best-selling book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And he spent a whole lifetime studying decision making amongst undergraduates at the schools where he taught. The last school where he taught was at Princeton. So you're talking here about one of the 5 most competitive schools in the United States to get into. Okay, and his colleague, with whom he did a lot of the early research he carried out, Amos Tversky, was at Stanford. So we have studies based on Stanford students or Princeton students. They both were originally from Israel, where they're at Hebrew University. So you have these insights based on very smart undergraduate students. And in these experiments, there's very few controls. These experiments are very often carried out physically in a classroom. So that bothers me. Okay, it bothers me because in the work I've done in survey research, I spend easily a third to 40% of my time setting up a proper sample, a representative sample. Okay, it takes a lot of effort to put together the proper sample, but you want a good sample, a representative sample, so that you can generalize your findings. The findings you have can generalize from a representative sample to the population at large. When you're generalizing from a bunch of undergrads, you're generalizing on how 18-year-olds from affluent societies who are very smart, who are still immature, how they make decisions. And that isn't what we should be doing, in my opinion. So that's the basis of my criticism.
Okay, so when the samples are not random, then your results are not representative.
Yeah, well, you can even do non-random representative sampling, but where you at least try to get sort of in proportion to the population, people who are 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, right up to 60, let's say. You try to get people from different socioeconomic strata, or at least the strata that you're interested in. If you're trying to look at how managers make decisions, then you want a representative sample of managers. Okay, and they're not going to be 18 years old.
Okay, let's move from experimental psychology to the field of neuroscience. What about empirical studies in the neuroscience?
Well, I'll break it into 2 categories. We have modern empirical studies, which using in the neuroscience area, which really began in the mid-1990s, even as Timothy Wilson was doing his psychological studies on experimentally and all that. You had in the neuroscience areas, you have people using things like electroencephalograms, EEGs, to see what is a reading on an EEG, what's the output reading when you ask subjects to make different kinds of decisions. About the same time, you would have something very similar to a lie detector test. They have a thimble that goes over a finger that measures skin conductance, electrical skin conductance, where you have different changes in electrical flow and so forth that can be measured on a graph. And so you would ask people questions that were emotion-filled, non-emotional questions, and seeing if there's any kind of reaction, corresponding reaction that tied to brain functioning. And of course, the most sophisticated of the tools available to us, which arose in the late 1990s, was the most sophisticated tools are tied to fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And these are those fMRI studies. You have somebody in an fMRI machine, and then you give them different decision-making scenarios, and you can see with different decision-making scenarios, different parts of the brain light up. So you can see that certain kinds of scenarios and certain kind of conditions are handled by different parts of the brain. Now, I mentioned this is the more modern, and we have historically, back in the 1840s, a very famous incident that occurred where you had an accident where the foreman, his name is Phineas Gage, a foreman of a railroad crew, had a steel bar, an iron bar, go through his head. Okay, and it literally went right through his head. It was blew through his head and landed something like 50 meters behind him. But he was conscious. He was able to function, and he lived for several years. And people, his physician, his friends, noticed that after the accident, which went through the forebrain, okay, the bar went through the forebrain. After his accident, his personality changed, and they also concluded, at least some people concluded, that his decision-making capabilities dropped, that he wasn't as capable, as able to make basic decisions after the accident as he was before. So there was even speculation later on by researchers in the 20th century that this Phineas Gage accident demonstrated that there's a link between different parts of the brain and actually how people make decisions.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the empirically rooted decision making.
Sure.